All right, I just want to welcome everyone to our first ever SNATS chat. NATS has had great success with these chats for years. We're excited to begin presenting this forum aimed specifically at SNATS members. So if you have ideas for future topics for SNATS chats, you can email those to me. I'm going to type my email address here in the chat window so you can all see it because my name is spelled weird. There we go. So you'll all see that. Feel free to email me topic ideas, guests you think might be great for us, things you'd like to have discussed on these SNATS chats, and we'll keep those in mind for future. So the way this is going to work is in a moment I will formally introduce our guest, and I'll ask her a few questions to get us started. Then she has a presentation she will share with us regarding our topic, Not Lost in Translation, Adapting Classical Technique to Musical Theater Styles. And afterwards, we'll have some time for questions from attendees. So there are a couple of ways you can ask your questions. You can raise your virtual hand on your list of attendees. You can raise that, and I will unmute you, and you can ask your question yourself, or you can type your question to me, and when there's a good time, I will read it to Lynn and have her answer. Do please keep your questions in mind or jot them down as we're going through the slide presentation, because I guarantee you some of your questions will be answered in future slides. So hold tight to those questions. Be ready to ask them when the presentation is finished, okay? So with that, I think we can go ahead and formally introduce our guest, Professor Lynn Helding, who's on the faculty of the Thornton School of Music at USC. She's a thought leader within the dynamic field of contemporary voice science, or vocology, and thus was elected to head the founding of the first nonprofit vocology association, PAVA, and she is an associate editor of the Journal of Singing and creator/author of the journal's Mindful Voice column, which illuminates current research in the cognitive, neuro, and social sciences as they relate to music teaching, learning, and performance. She's in demand as a master teacher and popular lecturer on cognitive topics at universities, conferences, and workshops across the US and Canada. I have to say personally, we had you here at Utah State, what, a couple months ago? Was that when you were here?
March.
Yeah, in March, right? And it was a real pleasure. You're all in for a great treat. And the second I heard her presentation, I hunted her down and said, "You have to come do this for our first SNATS chats. It's going to be perfect for this forum." So, without further ado, please welcome Lynn. Thank you so much for joining us for our first SNATS chat.
Yay! Inaugural SNATS chat. Love it.
Exactly. Making history right now. So
Yeah.
I want to ask you a few questions about this topic, and then we will set you loose and share your presentation with us. First of all, why is this an important topic for the SNATS audience?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think it's important because in most music schools, and I know it's certainly true of ours here at USC, the graduate teaching assistants are all being trained in the upper program. So they are studying classical voice, and they, part of their scholarship and part of their TA is to teach our non-majors who want to take lessons. And the vast majority of those students are not really wanting to sing or study classical styles. Some do, but most of them and many of them are already singing music theater. They're singing in pop. They're singing in other styles. And so I think it's, even though NATS as an organization has come on board, thankfully, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of that, but I think we still lag behind in terms of what the grad students are teaching. So I think doing that reinforce, so that's sort of specific to the SNATS audience. I think it reinforces the idea that classical is best, and often people think that classical being best also means it's healthiest, and we really can thank voice science for showing us that this simply is factually not true. The second thing is that what I would call the timbral, as in timbre, the timbral goals of non-classical singers are just really different, and in fact, in some ways, they're diametrically opposed. So I think when I began to teach the pedagogy courses here, that was kind of the first thing I was really excited about, was to, after we do the Foundations in Vocology sequence, and we're into the practicum, to really help them use that information to teach other styles responsibly and intelligently. And I think it's perfectly possible. So that's the why.
I think it's essential too. One of the reasons why I was so excited about having you here for our inaugural SNATS chat was because so many of our students out there in the SNATS program, they're receiving classical voice lessons and they're having requests from people to teach them voice lessons, from high school students or younger college students. And very few of those students want to study classically. They want to study musical theater. They want to get ready for their auditions, for their high school musical. So I think it's so important for our future teachers to be equipped to teach that style. So I'm thrilled. I agree completely with you. So at USC, do you teach your graduate student teachers all kinds of CCM, contemporary commercial music?
No, I don't. I pretty much confine it to what I just sometimes just call music theater voice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not because I have anything against the other styles. It's just, first of all, it's the place I'm most comfortable, because I used to sing a lot of music theater when I was younger, and I still go back to my home music theater place in the summer. They have a huge music theater program, so that's part of it. But the other reason is that the way that I teach it, I actually use. I use a lot of resonance, specifically formant tuning theory and narrative reactance theory from Ingo Tietze, and I use that to get this kind of sound. And it's really important to me that it also benefit the classical singers. I mean, I've found that it can really help their singing. So that's really why. As I find so many commonalities. I'm going to talk a little bit about that tonight too, that it isn't so much, either or, that there are some real mixy places that you can find in your own voice that can help your classical singing.
That's great. And so any other reasons that you avoid other CCM styles as you're teaching?
No, just, I mean, I completely respect them. It's just not what it's not what I was brought here to do, in part. Also, I think certain, like jazz, for instance, there is a much higher rate of airflow. I'm too misty, that kind of sound, which doesn't really feed into how we're training our classical singers or our belters,
Right.
to really use the airflow super efficiently and make the most strongest signal sound that you can.
Right. Yeah. I think those other styles, CCM styles, are so reliant on amplification, whereas
Yeah. Well,
this.
actually, yeah, that's a good point. I didn't mention that, but that's actually one of the reasons I don't, especially pop, because it's so studio oriented, so mixed, so in the studio, and that's just way outside of my interest and expertise. So no, that's why.
Great. Well, I think that sets us up really well. If you want to share with us your presentation.
Okie dokie. Let's see if we can get this up. So, Paul, I'm going to push show. I'm going to bring up my show, and I'm going to hope that it works. So let's see.
I see it.
Oh, yay! We are so good. All right, well, let's move through this. So I'm going to tell my audience, maybe about 15 minutes. I have about 20 slides, and just a couple things that I really want to make sure that I share with you. So first of all, terminology. We want to give a big shout out to Jeannie Levetri, who came up with this term, CCM, Contemporary Commercial Music. It's a great term. I use it a lot. It's really important that we stop saying non-classical, which is rather pejorative. So I use that term. But I also just find myself in casual conversation, which this is a little bit casual. So please don't anybody get upset if I use these other terms interchangeably. That's just what happens. So what I want to really share with the SNATS audience tonight, I was speaking with Eric earlier and telling him I'm already surprised to learn among my students here that they don't really know the history of how hard certain people fought just to get the topic of belting taken seriously. So I'm going to take you a quick tour through the attitudes that I grew up with when I was a student. And I'm not going to read all this to you. I'm just going to sort of highlight. So Cornelius Reed, famous voice teacher, said belting is not legitimate use of the mechanism. It's extremely detrimental. There was an article in the Journal of Singing dated 1986, which I don't know about you, but to me that seems like just yesterday. It is damaging to laryngeal tissue. A belting female vocalist is forcing larynx to function abnormally. Female vocalists can render themselves baritones for life. Oh no! No, Eric, no. Sarah doesn't so. In a
I'm not
short
sharing gigs with anyone. No more baritones.
Repeated abuse causes irreversible pathological changes in laryngeal tissue. Now, again, we just have to say this is what was believed at the time, and to me, that just does not seem very long ago. Barbara Dosher, again, famous teacher. These are very abusive behaviors. She likened it to what happens to cheerleaders and noted that the instance of vocal nodes, which again is not the correct use of the term, we corrected fortunately by our SLP friends, vocal nodules would occur. So that was kind of the backdrop, and I want to share with everybody that in January 2000, the first ever SNATS workshop was devoted to belt singing. It was the best attended workshop in SNATS history at that time. In fact, it was so well attended that a second one followed immediately the following year. I can tell a little story about a former teacher of mine who telephoned me when he first found out that this belt workshop was going to happen. And he said, the day that SNATS takes belt seriously is the day that I resign. And so this was the backdrop. I would just point out to the audience that it's really important as you become, as you go in your singing journey, but also your teaching journey, just to take a moment to look back historically and just see where we've come. I would also add that the huge reason that we did finally allow, and I'm putting that in quotes, this to even be talked about has to do with a few people. Robert Edwin, certainly at SNATS, and some other names I'm going to show you in a minute. But we also have to thank voice science, and we also have to thank the fact that science is objective, and it allowed people to get their emotions out of the way and just simply look at the facts, or the facts as we know them thus far, and there's still a lot we don't know, but there were simple things that people began to notice. For example, how is it that certain belters seem to be singing and singing and singing and singing, and they're not damaging their laryngeal tissue? So these were things that were taken seriously, and finally we had the sea change at the turn of the new millennium. So I'm going to share some definitions and thoughts that came from that workshop, and these are all names of teachers who are fairly well known for teaching this style. There have since been some new names, but these were the ones that were brought in for that first workshop, the first and second actually. Certainly not all of them, but I'm just going to go through this quickly. Neil Seymour says that this sound, this non-classical / popular / CCM style, belt style, is based in speech, and there's a greater TA activity, but it's not done with just pure chest voice. Mary Saunders says it's a theater sound that's produced from a mixed speaking voice, and there can't be any belting in head voice. Jeannie Lovetri, who I mentioned earlier, has written and teaches this style a lot, says it's generally associated with women's voices. Joa still was an early pioneer, no longer with us, but should be thanked profusely for just really hanging in there and bringing this attention, bringing this voice to attention in previous SNATS gatherings. When I was still a student. She mentions that there's high effort in the head, but mentions that if optimum conditions aren't maintained, that yes, indeed, there is a high risk of traumatizing the voice, but it it's exciting, this sound, and it's exciting partly because there is that risk. It's visceral, you can feel it. Lisa Popiel here in Los Angeles allows that there is still no consensus on terminology, but she uses belting as sort of a general term, as do I, to mean any sort of non-classical style that's speech-like or even yell-like. Lisa also has subdivided belting into 5 different sub-styles, and if you have never seen her present, you should. She also, I've listed her NATS chat as a great resource for you all. She is amazing. She can demonstrate in all of these different styles at the drop of a hat. So the commonalities that most people agree on is that it mostly involves the female voice. It's very strong. It's speech-like. Some people even use this term calling. It's very exciting. It definitely can be done above and is done above the primo passaggio. It is non-classical. It's built for the theater. It is perhaps risky, but it can be done very healthfully particularly if you're not squeezing or pressing your vocal folds. We'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute. We know it's commercially successful for sure. It's the voice that has been used for Broadway, quote unquote, and then some other non-classical styles, but usually not jazz, which has a much higher airflow rate, or folk, what we just would think of as folk singing. More associated with women's voices than men, and often these singers are untrained, although that is changing, as we know. Belt voice is not simply chest voice pushed too high. This is an interesting point that came up in the 2000 and 2001 workshops over and over and over again, and in fact it was demonstrated over and over again for a slightly skeptical audience. And I think that was a real eye-opener and ear-opener for a lot of people. And also we need to say it is not the one and only cause of vocal pathologies. Again, if we speak to our voice health friends, our speech-language pathologist friends, they will tell us that it's a multiplicity of behaviors that usually result in vocal nodules and other mucosal disorders. So we can never just pin it on one thing. So here's a little scientific comparison, which I think is really important because it gives us this objective view. So very quickly, this is in the literature, so you guys can find it. Belt voice does use a heavier vocal fold configuration and a thicker TA muscle. And classical, it gradually thins and gives up as it goes higher. In belt, there's been a lot of interest in this idea. Certainly the larynx is higher, but it is possibly tilted or even leaned. Lisa Popiel calls it leaned. In classical, the larynx is relatively lower, but the degree of lowness is a subject of hot debate, and I'm not going there. In belt, definitely the pharynx is smaller, so you have a smaller resonating cavity, you're going to get a brighter sound and higher harmonics. In classical, especially in certain schools, and Richard Miller called them by name sometimes, so the German school or the Nordic school, the pharynx is much wider open. Maybe in the Italian school, not quite so much, but certainly not as closed up as we would have in this belt style. Interestingly, in belt singing, the closed quotient, that's the CQ you see there, which just measures how long the vocal folds are actually closed in their cycle, has been measured above 50%, as high as 78% in really super duper heavy belting. We used to think that not so much in classical, but this is not shown in all studies. Scott McCoy did an interesting study that showed the closed quotient was about the same in robust opera singing as it was in belting. So that's something I think we really should think about. I think that is a really cool thing. In belt, there's more subglottic pressure needed to blow the vocal folds apart. Less than in belt, but again, we don't know about that now with this CQ thing. Belt, less airflow than classical, and the acoustic signal can be a little bit noisier. particularly if you are being asked to, some music directors will say dirty up the sound. So they don't want it so clean. They don't want the harmonics lined up so well. They want to have a little in the sound. And as I keep saying, it's a little bit more associated with women. And as we know with classical, that's not the case. So that brings us
I'm
to...
sorry, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah,
Just for our students out there who maybe are in pedagogy right now or have yet to take pedagogy, I'm thrilled that you're here listening, but just so you know, the TA muscles that Lynn was referring to, those are your thyroid muscles, right? That's the base layer of your vocal folds, and that's the muscles we most commonly associate when you say chest voice or mode 1 phonation. You're usually the way of thinking about it is that that's more utilizing your TA muscles. And then the closed quotient, that is the part of the vibratory cycle where your glottis is effectively closed, right? So just for those who are not yet in pedagogy or in the midst of it, that's what we're talking about when we talk about those things.
Great, thank you. So moving on to the question of, do men belt? Well, it depends on who you talk to. So dipende, as they say in Italiano, depends on who you talk to. So some people say yes, men belt because male music theater singers just sound non-classical, end of discussion. Some people say no, men do not belt because male musical theater singers use the same registration strategy as male classical singers. So speaking of the TA muscle, their TA muscles stay engaged throughout their range, which brings the last crowd to say, well, yes, they do belt because of what we just said, C number 2. So I think I kind of go with number 3. It's the yes and no and the no and yes question. And I think it just has to do with choosing a slightly different resonance strategy. So just to wrap up on that, my opinion is that for women, it's a much greater divide, let's say. It is a different technique. Whereas for men, it's just dialing the resonances a little bit differently. So men, I don't think, have to make quite as a big a leap. Particularly if they are learning what an Italian vocal technique, I think it's not a big deal at all for men. That's my opinion. So at that point, Eric, do you want to jump in any bit before we move on to the how-to?
No, I don't think so. We don't have any urgent questions flashing through, so I think let's just jump in. I just want to remind you all that you have access. Lynn's about to start referring to a handout. You should see the ability to download that handout as a PDF in your control panel for the chat session for the webinar. So check that out. You're going to want to download that now because Lynn's going to start referring to it. And you'll all be thankful that you're muted because I think Lynn's going to have you start doing stuff in your house with noises. So warn the neighbors, download the handout, and we'll jump into this section.
Great, thank you, Eric. So now again, I'm going to just do a little caveat here. This is how I do it, and there's certainly other ways and that are just as viable and just as wonderful, I think. But I have found the most useful things have been when people have just been brave enough to share and say, this is how I do it. So for that, I would highly recommend, again, Elisa Popiel, who will just tell you, well, this is what I think. This is how I handle it. Mary Saunders Bartner, who does her Bel Canto Can Belto series, very generous sharing of this is what I think, this is how I do it. So, it isn't necessarily the world according to me, but for the next few minutes, it is. So I have found the best vowels for finding the resonance for empty voice are the so-called closed vowels. And this is one place where already I think it's really important to insert the classical singers to a person. When I watch them, my grad students teach, they'll pick ah. Well, why ah? Well, because a lot of classical singers love ah. Particularly women classical singers. They love ah because it makes them feel like they're open. But for if you want to teach this style, You want to really make friends with these vowels. So the E and A and what I call their open cousins, I and E. But the very best vowel in my book for finding the resonance is A, as in cat. And what's lovely about this vowel is there are so many words in English that have this A. So if you forget, just take out your Dr. Seuss Cat in the Hat, and you will find all of them, and you can make up some really interesting exercises. I also, I don't believe in just doing exercises and vocalises on just vowels because it does not mimic language enough. And so consonants, the best consonants to pair with these vowels are the voiced consonants. And again, for those of you who have not taken your pedagogy or vocology classes yet, the difference between voiced and unvoiced consonants are that the vocal folds are actually engaged on voiced consonants, and many of them have unvoiced pairs or cognates. So a simple example is the V sound or the F sound. So both are bilabial consonants, but one, or sorry, labiodental consonants, that is teeth and lips, but one, the vocal folds are engaged, and one they are not. And if you're not sure, you can test. If you can make a pitch, then you have found a voiced consonant. If you can't, no matter how hard you try, that means your vocal folds are not able to make that pitch. They're not engaged. So I use M and V, Z, V as in they, nya as in onion, and ng as in sing. And I put those together. I'll show you in a minute. The sensations you're going for, these are words that many successful belters will describe when they're singing well and it doesn't feel like they're hurting anything or that they're loading up anything unhealthily. That it feels twangy, it feels easy, that's important. It feels whiny, mixy, very frontal, very far in the front of their face, of their head. Light, I've heard that before. Buzzy, and definitely not in the back of the throat. Now this is important. I have found that adding what I call an emotional stance or attitude is really, really important. You just can't find these sounds very well in a neutral state. I find that being whiny or flirty or sort of flippant with a little saucy attitude works. If you can't access that, then we go with a little anger. Not the kind of anger where you're going to just explode, but just slightly upset. One caution with any of these, especially the anger emotion, don't let your voice grind. It's just not necessary, and I'm not a real fan of grinding. So this is how I do it. That's kind of my basic recipe, and I have people do things. So now I'm going to make some sounds. So I have them do things like yeah, 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 yeah. And if it's my classical singers that are trying to figure this out, I'll have them do a classical yeah, yeah, and then I have them do yeah, and then we do a little more attitude like yeah, 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 I know, like yeah, 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 you're bugging me, and very quickly we can sort of find that sort of whiny little place. And then we sort of catch it and we move on. I have a whole bunch of sentences. I just put a few up here that follow my recipe. So you'll notice in the first one, that cat makes me mad. I'm using the A, the A, and the E. And I'm also leading with these voiced consonants. So I've got a V and an in there. Later on, I've got a Z down. So we do that cat makes me mad. And if you add a little attitude, instead of that cat makes me mad, which maybe isn't so angry, you might be a little more angry about it. So that cat makes me mad. And you find that kind of quality. Sometimes I do have people do like a little witchy voice, like ha ha ha. And we'll take that ha 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 into kind of a sound. They may make me sneeze. That one isn't so angry. It's sort of funny and silly. Sometimes if people are having trouble even accessing any of that, we'll just pause on the TH. So we'll do a until we can get that really vibrating, and then we'll go to the vowel. So that's sort of how I do that. Sometimes I use speaking exercises to find belt resonance. This is just me. I've found for some reason, I don't use these very much when it's in a studio and it's just me and the student. But I use these a lot in master classes, particularly acting master classes, and especially if I have a big room, because I find people can really sort of get into this in an acting, method acting sort of way. So I have them do some of these sentences. You can make up your own. I make them really elongate the vowel and then swoop up and down in pitch. We want to think whiny, but not bratty. So I'll show you what I mean. So I do something like, why, mama? Why, I don't wanna. So that's whiny. But if we get bratty, we get, why, mama, I don't wanna. And then we get the fry in there and we're in trouble. So I make sure it just stays sort of, oh, sort of sad rather than angry. So we do things like, why me? And Daddy, you're so mean. And we'll move those around, and sometimes just have them kind of get all those going at once. No way! And maybe we'll go up and down and sort of catch a pitch and sing it a little bit. That works pretty well. Puppy whines are great. In my experience, sopranos in particular really like this one. So you place your tongue between your teeth and very, 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 very gently, I hesitate to even use the word bite, but you'll get the idea. You just sort of firm it up. And then you whine like a little puppy. And you want to make sure that when you are doing that, that you notice that you'll have to use quite a bit of abdominal pressure to supply the necessary air flow or subglottal pressure to do this. So you want to make sure that you're not recruiting your strap muscles. Those are the muscles that will flare out in your neck. I might show that when the video comes back on. But you want to make sure that you're really using abdominal pressure. And I would just note, if you're in a studio that doesn't teach that as part of your breathing system, that's fine. You will need to use a lot of it when you close up your vocal tract this much. It's almost impossible not to have something pressing, and that something is much better off located, in my book, in your abdominal musculature and not in your neck muscles. Specifically for the science heads out there, you don't want your extrinsic and intrinsic laryngeal muscles squeezing to make that sound. So I'm almost done here. This is really important. I found that these techniques can assist classical technique, and that is, I think, really, really, really important. So I want to stress that here, particularly these voice types and in this situation. So sopranos and lyric mezzos in their low middle voice. So that area of the voice for many women that feels very weak. And by the way, this is the area of the voice that belt singers hate being in. They'd rather be higher because they feel like they can get more power. So if we can really build up that lower middle voice for them, I've found that for classical singers, these techniques have been super helpful. Obviously, they're not going to sing Mozart in their low middle voice quite in that resonance place, but sometimes we can start it and then sort of warm it up and find a really nice kind of mixy sound. Tenors have had a lot of success helping tenors accessing the very highest notes in their range. You know, I probably not even A, I would say more like B flat, B natural, and even high C. There, that's it. We are done. We're going to go back to, hopefully you'll see me in a minute. Yay! Okay. Questions? Do we have questions?
All right. Yeah. Lynn, can you turn off your share screen so that we can
turn off my share screen? Okay. Stop showing screen.
There we go. There. Now we can see you.
Okay.
Even better. That's awesome. So we've got a few questions already.
Wunderbar. Let's go. Let her rip.
All right, so the first one is kind of a response to something you said in the presentation, which is, are there ways you can get your voice to sound angry if it's necessary for the performance without that grind? Or there are techniques you would recommend for that?
Yeah, I would get pouty.
Howdy. Mm-hmm.
Pouty. But really, don't underestimate the power of method acting. So go in your imagination for when you really wanted something and it for some reason did not come to you. You
Mm-hmm.
know? Why not? I'm so mad. Come on, you guys, stop teasing me. You know, those kinds of sounds. We can all access them. We just have to go there.
Great. Another question similar to that, you mentioned in the presentation vocal fry.
Mhm.
This question asker wants to know, is vocal fry bad for your voice? I've seen some teachers use it. Some teachers avoid it. They want to know if that's the same thing as the grinding you were mentioning.
No, I don't think it is. Vocal fry has been given, a pretty bad rap, and it's really confusing for young singers right now because it's also used therapeutically. It's
Hmm.
also used in acoustic studies. Donald Miller uses it to help people find their formants. So,
Yeah.
right. Um, Seth Riggs used it, very famous teacher here in LA. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. Makes me cough. Um, to help people actually adduct their vocal folds better. So it is used in therapy and it's used in voice science research. So from everything I put together in that, I would say it's when it becomes a habit of speech that we worry. So
Hmm.
particularly with female voices, and by the way, everybody gets all woo about this, but let me just say it's not fair. It's just the way things are. That women are at a little bit higher incidence of mucosal disorders like nodules simply because we speak at a higher frequency than men. And if you just take a simple mathematical ratio and say, well, women are banging their vocal folds together about twice as often, then we're just a little bit more um, prone. So the vocal fry that we have to be careful of in speech and hope I'm not doing would be things like at the end of every sentence, I just kind of check out. And so when I'm talking, I'm very engaged, but no, I'm going to just be done with that. So uh, that's a vocal habit or characteristic I'm sure you've read about, and people get teased about it a lot. But there have been some studies about how seriously you're taken when you vocal fry. There's been a very strong reaction against that. But just in terms of vocal health, I would say it's a good thing to get out of your habitual speech. Lisa Popeil actually uses it in singing, and I think there are a lot of sounds that have to be available to us as singing actors. So that's kind of another way I talk about it is this know that it's in your toolkit, but it's something that's probably a little harder on the vocal fold mucosa. It probably dries it a little bit. Um, I would use it sparingly and not at all while you're speaking.
Right. So, friends, if you're curious what that sounds like speaking, just Google any video of Kim Kardashian talking at all, and then you'll hear. That's where it'll be. So we've got a few typed questions, but Charlotte has her hand up. So Charlotte, I'm going to unmute you, and you can ask Lynn your question. All right? Maybe. Oh, I didn't do that. Paul, I don't think oh, there we go. Charlotte, go for it.
Hi, thanks for sharing all of your knowledge with us. I was going to ask you, I have a student who is looking for that. We're working on looking for that twangy sound, yet he is relying mostly on his nose for resonance. How to
Oh,
avoid that?
how interesting. Okay, you just touched on one of my favorite topics, Charlotte. So, quickie, the first thing that you want to make sure he understands is that true rate nasal resonance is not what he thinks it is. So we have to have a quick sidebar on what is resonance. Resonance is reflections within a void or within space. And in a free resonator, that's what we are. So our resonator, mostly in the voice, is the pharynx and the oral cavity. So right? Back of the throat and inside of the mouth. So if I go, ah, and I even go, yeah, that makes some people sound nasal, but in fact, I can test for, yeah. If I close my nose and no change occurs, it's not nasal resonance. Nasal resonance is when you lower the nasal port like this, and you let some of the sound go through. And so instead of yeah, you have yeah, and that's how you can test. Because if you plug your nose, it'll stop. So the first thing you want to do with this student is help him understand the difference. In Scott McCoy's book Inside View, it's discussed very well, very succinctly. And then the next thing is, I would ask you, which of those is he doing?
I think he has a little bit of tension in his tongue. I don't know if that's related. So his tongue is a little bit high, which makes him go into his nose. Because we've done that exercise of putting his hand on his nose, and it definitely is the nose that's like creating the sound.
Okay, so Charlotte, here's the deal. So you have to teach him how to close his nasal port. And unless he has a frank abnormality, now some children who were born with cleft palate cannot do this. But absent that, if he has normal development, he should be able to close his nasal port. And the best way that I know of doing that is telling them it's the ah before the chew, as in sneezing, as in ha, right before you go. Chew. So have him catch the teach him how to lift his soft palate crazy high and close that nasal.
Right.
And go ahead and let the back of his tongue right now. I wouldn't try to fix that. As long as the back of his tongue is what I would call fluffy. And I borrowed that from Dirty. Fluffy tongue, I love it. So it's kind of like, oh, like homicide tongue, and then super sneezy. So it's like, ah, like before he sneezes.
Yeah.
See if you can get that kind of going. He's got to learn to close his nasal port.
Okay.
Thanks, Charlotte.
All right. Thanks a lot.
Hi, Charlotte.
All right, we've got a. There we go. All right, we've got a few more typed questions. So, many of us are taught that the passaggio in women are around an octave apart, depending on what the voice type is, around E flat, E natural, F, F sharp, in classical technique. But in musical theater styles, many women talk about a break that occurs around B flat.
Mm-hmm.
Are these the same thing at a different pitch location? Are they different phenomenon? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, no, it's just that it's like, okay. So it's a huge question, and does this person have a name so I could sort of say, hi, John, or?
Yeah, that's Crystal.
Okay, Crystal. So what I would do first is you really do need to either review or learn a lot about acoustics theory, because what we really need to get our heads around in this day and age of science is that any passaggi we're talking about are not just a physiological phenomenon. That's what we were taught, right? Well, it's when we go from one set of muscles to the other. For certain women, that's true. And there does seem to be a place around B flat where the vocal ligament cannot stretch any further, although I think that needs to be relooked at. But what we really, really need to get our heads around is that when the acoustics are favorable, and I'm trying to make this really simple because it's a huge answer. When the acoustics are favorable, something called inertive reactance, which Ingo Tietze has written a lot about, actually help the vocal folds vibrate at their maximally efficient level. So Scott McCoy has even said in his book that for men, the registration event is not physiological, in that way that we understand of switching muscular groups. It is a dynamic change of the acoustics. But as I remind my class, acoustics have physiological effects, especially when we understand that the sound waves go back down the tube and actually influence the way the vocal folds are vibrating. And if that sounds like, oh my gosh, that's really cool but really complicated, yes, it is. It is, but it's cool stuff, and we all need to learn it. So what we do know is that around those pitches you mentioned, the first pitches, I teach my class D4 and D5. Around D4, there is definitely something happening. And acoustically, that something is that our vocal tract, which is about 17 centimeters long, and it's curved, and it's bumpy, and it's warm, and it's wet, is not favorable to that frequency. And at about double the hertz, that is an octave, we see a similar but not as pronounced phenomenon. So that's why you see this D4 or E flat, E, you mentioned F. I'm not sure I agree with the F, but D, D sharp, E-ish, and an octave above. But for belters, yeah, something happens around B flat, and if they are singing only heavy chest TA belt, which I'm not even sure I can demonstrate anymore, but you know, just that really and something happens, they can't get past that. The high belters figured out, just by fiddling around with their own voices, that they could go a lot higher if they didn't start in that heavy mechanism. So if you have a heavy belter, you got to kind of get them to be willing to release some of that heavy belt mechanism before B flat, so that you can go on beyond B flat. It was a huge question. I would highly recommend, here, hold it up, The Vocal Athlete by Wendy LeBourne and Marcy Rosenberg. They talk about belt voice a lot in this book, and they talk about what I just talked about. Innervative reactance and the acoustics and formant tuning theory and all those sciencey things that have really changed the game for us, I think.
I think that's a great question, and I really appreciate the answer. I think it's important because in your classical lessons, students, you're going to be hearing about these passaggio that happen at these places, and then you might have a musical theater student who don't really experience that, but they do experience that big break at B flat. So being able to talk about both, I think, is great. So wonderful, fantastic. Let's let one of we have Kristen with her hand up. Let's let her ask a question. Let me unmute you. Oh, 1 second. Kristen, what's your question for Lynn?
So it's kind of going off of what you just answered, but I'm currently studying classical and music theater, sometimes up and down, and I'm going through this voice change apparently, where I'm a soprano, but then now I'm a mezzo, if that's not really that big of a deal. But I've noticed in the practice room that when I'm singing classically, I can't sing an E or an F in tune necessarily, and they're always pretty, it's kind of difficult. But then if I belt it or straight tone in a way, it feels a lot better and it feels completely natural. So I don't understand why that's an issue or why they're so different from each other.
What's your name again?
Kristen?
Okay, hi Kristen.
Hi.
So first of all, which E are you talking about?
E5.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, that's in my studio, that we don't like that pitch.
all the other voice teachers right now, I'm sure, are laughing because we all experience this a lot.
Yeah, I call D to F the Bermuda Triangle, where a great tone went to die and get lost. So you're experiencing that upper passaggio phenomenon. So it is remember what I said, you're going to have issues at about double the frequency. What I've found is that those issues aren't functional so much as they become resonance choices. So again, I don't know you, I don't know your voice, but I know that for my particularly my lyric mezzos, who have a lot of them have real intonation problems between D and F. we have to work really hard to find it's formant tuning, basically. So finding the best vowel. So right around, so I'm going to give you some real specific info. Right around D5, you are close to the formant for the A vowel, which means that singing A around that pitch and that vowel should really like each other. And what you have to figure out is, in your voice with your structures, and we're all a little bit different. Do you like to sing an A or an A or an E? I mean, what works best for you? A super bright A, a little bit more open. You want to fiddle around with your lips. If you feel like your belty voice is really good there, sometimes I'll ask my student, okay, then what about that sound can teach the other sound how to behave? So one thing you might want to look at is in your classical voice, are you going too far back? Are you doing, ooh, because if you're way back there on that pitch, you're going to have intonation problems. So another way I say it in my studio is you got to switch sooner. You have to think of that D and D sharp and E, that area, as higher and not belonging to this weighty, heavier voice. So that's my best answer without hearing you. But
Thank you.
Good luck being a switch hitter. You go. Go, girl.
And I'm trying to remember correctly, dropping the jaw a little bit will raise the first formant right up towards that E natural, and also lip rounding will raise both formants, correct?
Yeah, so you also are close to ooh there. So you can kind of sort of think about, would that be A? That's I don't know, A is beltier, but probably doesn't work, you know? So that's what I would do. So you got to really fiddle around with your voice and figure out, and then get other pairs of ears to help you say that sounded good, and then you figure out why.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, Kristen. We have two questions that are kind of similar, so I want to kind of group them together. Asking about working on musical theater and classical at the same time. One is kind of asking, is it okay to work on them both at the same time, or should you be alternating? And one asks, if you can work on them at the same time, how do you recommend practicing shifting between the two styles?
Okay, so this is where it gets into pedagogical opinion. So this is just my opinion, and I guarantee you that there are people out there that would say, what? That's ridiculous. So fine, they can have their opinions, but my opinion is this. If first of all, I would want to be sure that I'm talking about the female voice right now. And I'll tell you what I would say to guys. Yes. Yes, that's easy. For women, I think it's a little more complicated. So here's what I say. I would say if you're singing classically and you're very committed to that, and you want to dip your toe, you will learn a ton by singing the so-called golden age stuff, the Rodgers and Hammerstein, Lerner and Lowe, because what that's about is making resonance choices. And I think that's super important as a singing artist. And I talk about this in my studio all the time, even with my only classical singers. And we'll talk about resonance choices for French melody as opposed to German art song. Really different. They're really different. It's not just all classical. So it depends on how far afield you're going. But if you're really looking at singing Elphaba, in that show, and then the next day, you're expected to bring in Mozart. Personally, I think that's very confusing for your muscles, and I would not recommend it. So again, I think sort of a twangy high belt. I've also seen people be able to sing some kind of like bluegrass, like Alison Krauss, great singer, by the way. If you want to listen to just really healthy but very light kind of high twangy belty stuff, that kind of works for a certain kind of soprano voice. But heavy, really brassy out there belting and classical in the female voice, in my opinion, other people can disagree with me, is not a good idea. I think it's just too confusing when you're trying to develop neural pathways and muscular memory to mix all that up in the same bucket.
Great. And then piggybacking off that question, we had someone ask, when you're teaching a student who is with you exclusively to learn musical theater belt style, do you bring in some classical repertoire to balance that, or no, you stick exclusively with that?
No, I don't, because it makes them unhappy, and by the time they get to me, they've had it with that.
Yeah.
they've already been to people that have done that with them, and they're not satisfied, and they don't feel like their singing's gotten any better, and they've gotten the message that classical is better. And, you know, we really owe it to people when they're paying us money to help them sing the style they want to sing best. So, no, I don't.
Great. I know we have the list of articles and books and also Lisa's SNATS chat. Are there any other people who are interested in making this crossover, either teaching or singing, other resources you'd recommend checking out?
I think I put them all there for now.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, there's also Vocopedia. I should have mentioned a shout out for Vocopedia, and there's a lot of stuff that has been posted. Jeannie Levetre's posted a bunch of stuff there, including her website. But this book is what I would get, and a lot of the same resources I listed are listed in this book.
Great. Vocopedia, friends, if you're not yet a NATS member or haven't explored that, you can get to Vocopedia through NATS, the NATS website. It's the online database of articles on myriad of topics. Definitely worth checking out if you haven't explored that yet. Okay, so really quickly, because we're almost out of time, I think, okay, let's ask this question first. Really, in the quickest you can, if you have a boy who's going through puberty who wants to explore musical theater styles, is it best just to wait, or is there some repertoire you'd recommend?
I don't, off the top of my head, I don't have repertoire to recommend. But if they are making good progress with their teacher, I think it's always best to keep singing, because he's going to sing anyway. He may as well be singing in lessons and getting help. So I'm sorry, off the top of my head, besides the obvious, you know, Oliver, I can't think of anything, because I don't teach young kids, so it's not an area I'm real familiar with.
Great. That's Kaylin. That's my student. We'll talk. We'll talk. We'll get some rep picked up. All right. And the last question we'll ask for her tonight is: so we have the 24 Italian art songs to help us teach classical technique. Do you have a belt song list to help teach belt technique? How do you pick repertoire for a younger singer if they don't come to you with something beyond their ability? Hey, I really want to sing this, but it's outside their ability range. Do you have a list that you go to?
Yeah, I have some just things that have always worked. Character, you know, like I'm just a girl who can't say no. I give that a lot because it's kind of light and funny and cute, and it's got the twangy stuff in it.
Maybe Adelaide too, that kind of thing.
Yeah, definitely. A poison can develop a cough. Yeah, because I use that New Jersey, we call it my New Jersey talk a lot to help find that place. Yeah, that's great. Character, I think character is a little bit better. It depends on, you know, just depends on what they're doing too. A lot of people come with stuff that they've been hired to do and they need help getting there.
Great. Well, I think we are about out of time. It's 8:31. So I want to thank you all who were here to participate in our inaugural SNATS chat. I think we had a really great discussion. And thank you, Lynn. Thank you so much for sharing your presentation with us and answering these questions. So I think we are going to sign off for the evening. So thank you again, Lynn. Have a wonderful night, everyone, and hopefully we'll see you at our next SNATS chat. You'll find information about that on the website and on social media as we pick topics and select a date for our next one. So thank you again. Have a great night.
Thanks.